we would have had to stop and give notice and wait for lawyers to show up to have a hearing, I guess, under the argument that's been made. Maybe that's the way it's going to go. I don't know. Anyway. I guess the good news is this is the last witness of the day. I'm kind of, if you guys aren't, I'm wearing down a little bit. Are we ready to go?
We are, Your Honor.
Ms. Hanania?
Ready, Your Honor.
Bring the jurors on in.
Jury men are in the courtroom.
All right, welcome back, folks. You can have a seat. And this will be the last witness of the day. And just to make you feel even a little better, I think I can go ahead and say on behalf of Ms. Corey, there'll be probably 2 more witnesses from the state on Monday. So we're moving right along, okay? Ms. Corey, your next witness.
Yes, sir. Maria Pagan.
Maria Pagan, please. Good afternoon, ma'am. If you'll come on up to the front, and if you'll raise your right hand, the clerk will administer the oath to you.
You solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you shall give to the truth.
Thank you, ma'am. If you'll come right around this way for me. All right, Ms. Corey.
Yes, sir. Tell these jurors your name.
My name's Maria Pagan, that's Pagan.
What is your profession?
I work for the Florida Department of Law Enforcement at the State Crime Lab in the firearms section.
What is the Florida Department of Law Enforcement?
It's the state policing agency.
How long have you been with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement?
It was 7 years in April.
What is your educational background?
I have a bachelor's degree in psychology from Brigham Young University, and I have a bachelor's degree in forensic science with a chemistry minor from the University of Central Florida.
What training have you had since taking a position with FDLE to stay abreast of your current expertise?
I've had approximately 20 months of in-house training at FDLE in the area of firearms and firearms identification.
Are you a member of any professional associations?
No.
What are your current duties at FDLE?
I examine and process firearms evidence.
Does that include bullets and casings,
Yes, it does.
the firearms, and then any other evidence attendant to those firearms?
Yes, the firearms themselves and any components such as bullets and cartridge cases and whatnot.
Have you ever qualified and been declared an expert in firearms identification in the courts of the state of Florida?
Yes, I have.
How many times?
I've been to trial, it's been over 60 times now.
And having been declared an expert in firearms in the courts of the state, have you gone on to then be able to give the jury an opinion in that same area?
Yes, I have.
Same amount of times?
Yes.
Your Honor, at this time I tender Ms. Pagan to the jury as an expert in firearms and ballistics.
Any objection? All right, ladies and gentlemen, as I mentioned, I think a little bit earlier, in this case, Ms. Pagan will be declared to be an expert in the area of firearms and ballistics. And in that regard, she can give opinion testimony about the area that she is an expert in. So, there you go.
Thank you, Your Honor. Ms. Pagan, let me go over some basics regarding firearms and ammunition with you. Are there numerous types and calibers of handguns?
Yes, there are.
Explain to this jury the difference between a revolver and a pistol.
One of the basic differences between a revolver and a pistol is the way that they feed the ammunition. With a revolver, which many people are familiar with, you have a round cylinder that the person loads the cartridges in, or the bullets, in the cylinder, and then each time you pull the trigger, it fires, but the spent cartridge cases remain in the revolver until the user opens it and removes them themselves. With a semi-automatic pistol, you have the cartridges are loaded in a magazine, which is inserted into the gun, and each time you pull the trigger, it fires, but then it automatically cycles, which causes it to automatically extract the spent cartridge case and eject it. It then automatically feeds another cartridge into the chamber, and it's ready to be fired again.
Let me ask you several questions regarding semi-automatic weapons. How are they designed to expel that projectile specifically?
It can vary from gun to gun. Typically speaking, though, most pistols are designed to expel it in generally in a right direction or upwards for the most part. And again, that's generally speaking.
So with semi-automatics, the shooter must pull the trigger each time to fire a bullet?
Yes, that's correct.
What happens when the trigger is pulled?
When the trigger is pulled, there is what's called a firing pin inside the gun. That firing pin drops. It hits the back end of the cartridge, which has a primer in it. That primer is what initiates the explosion. So the explosion occurs, and the pressure from that explosion forces the bullet to go down the barrel, and the cartridge case is slammed against the inside surfaces of the gun. The slide then moves backwards, pulls the cartridge case out of the chamber, and then what's called an ejector kicks the cartridge case out to the side or upward or whichever direction it travels in.
Is there more than one part to a bullet? Can you explain parts of a bullet?
Yes, what people commonly call a bullet is technically called a cartridge. It consists of a couple different components. You usually have a metallic cup, typically it's brass. That cup is what holds the gunpowder. And on the very bottom of the cup is a small metal cylinder disc that's embedded on the bottom side. That's what I refer to as the primer. That's what causes the spark. That's what the firing pin hits to cause the spark that starts the explosion. So you got the primer on the bottom, you got your metal cup, you then have gunpowder inside the cup, and then the bullet can be thought of as the top of the cup. The bullet sits on top of the cup, it's pushed down into the cup a little bit and slightly crimped in. So when that explosion occurs, that pressure builds up in the cup and pushes the bullet out. So you've got your bullet, your cartridge case, or cup, if you will, and the primer on the bottom, and the gunpowder inside.
If a cartridge or bullet is designated as 9 millimeter, 9 mm, can you tell the jury what that means?
9 millimeter is in reference to its caliber, which is to its diameter. That's the approximate metric unit of its diameter, which is actually 0.354 thousandths of an inch.
What is the range that a Taurus 9 millimeter can fire if unobstructed? If a shot is fired and it's unobstructed, nothing stops it, what would be the range on that?
I couldn't say exactly the exact range, but a bullet could travel very far if it had nothing to stop it. I would expect it to travel several hundred yards, and again, it would depend on, as well as the angle of the gun, the higher the gun's pointed, the further it will travel and whatnot, but it can travel a far distance.
And anytime a Taurus 9 millimeter is fired, what happens to the shell casing when that trigger is pulled?
Once it's, as we stated before, when it's fired, it automatically cycles backwards. It will extract that spent cartridge case, or casing, if you will. It will extract that casing and extract it and kick it out to the side, or eject it to the side at some point.
If a person were to fire something like a Taurus 9 millimeter standing right in front of all of us, and the shell's ejected, say it was fired 10 times, would you expect there to be a pattern on that ejection of those shells?
Do you mean would I expect them to all
Yes.
have gone the same way?
Yes.
Typically speaking, they tend to go in the same direction on any given gun. However, that's not always the case. But most likely they will go in the same direction each time, but there's other variables such as is the person moving, has their hand changed slightly direction, is all the ammunition the same kind of ammunition, so those variables can play into the way it's ejected.
And if it's an outdoor situation when the gun is fired, could that also affect whether or not the shell casings are in different locations?
Well, the environment can affect the location as well, because once it hits the ground or hits an object, it could bounce in any numerous directions. So you can't always expect to find them all in one little pile. they can bounce and move around or get kicked or hit around or something.
Does the fact that a bullet passes through an object, whether human or inanimate, have an effect on how pristine the projectile will be if found?
Yes, of course. If the bullet has, whatever object the bullet has hit is going to affect the kind of condition it is when it's pulled out. If it's hit something really hard or metal, or I expect to see more damage. As far as whether it hits a person, it would depend on whether it's mostly soft tissue, bone, and whatnot.
Can you give the jurors an example of how a semi-automatic, such as the 9mm Taurus, can be fired and have the projectile remain fairly pristine? What we do in our lab when we want pristine bullets is we fire it into water. So if you're firing into water, you would expect the bullet won't be very damaged. So if you're firing it into a softer object, you'd most likely expect to see less damage. Does a bullet that passes through metal, for example a vehicle, have a greater chance of becoming deformed or fragmented?
I would expect the chances to go up, but it's not always the case. But yes, I would expect the chances to go up.
Are there times when a bullet becomes so fragmented that you cannot even attempt to identify it as having been fired from a particular firearm?
Yes.
Can you explain why to the jury?
When we're making an identification to a bullet, what we're trying to do is identify that bullet to a specific gun. And to do that, we have to look at the marks that are on the bullet. When the bullet travels down the barrel, it receives striations because it's actually rubbing against the inside of the barrel. So there are striations along the body of the bullet that we use, those are the marks that we use to make our comparison to make an identification. So if a bullet has been very damaged and deformed, if the striations that are on the bullet are going to be damaged and deformed, they might also have been scrubbed off if it's hit an object that just wipes them clean. So the more damaged, deformed, the less likely it is that I'm going to be able to make an identification because that damage covers up or removes the markings that I need to make an identification.
Let me take you specifically to the facts of this case. Ms. Pagan, were certain items of physical evidence submitted to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement for you or another firearms examiner to perform tests and to examine for purposes of testifying in court?
Yes.
And are notes made in the normal course of your business as your agency receives these items and then as you perform your test on these items?
Yes, they are.
Are those notes specifically with regard to your findings reduced to a report that is kept by the Florida Department of Law Enforcement?
Yes.
Is a specific Florida Department of Law Enforcement case number assigned for all work done on the evidence in any given criminal case?
Yes.
Is there a specific FDLE case number assigned to the state of Florida versus Michael Dunn?
Yes, there is.
Can you tell the jurors that FDLE number?
Yes, the FDLE number is 2012-040-6772.
Right. And did you examine specifically evidence related to the shooting death of Jordan Davis in this case?
Yes, I did.
At whose request did you examine the evidence in this case?
It was submitted by JSO.
On what date did your lab take possession of the items to be examined?
Can I look at my notes?
Yes, please. I'm sorry, I should have said. If you need to refresh your memory, please look at your notes.
We received items on December 6, 2012, and on December 18th, 2012.
Can you please explain to the jury the Florida Department of Law Enforcement procedures for storing evidence until an expert takes custody of it to examine it?
Yes, when the contributor brings in the evidence, the people in our evidence intake section receive custody of it, and then they place it in a vault that has limited access. And then when I'm ready to pick up the evidence, I will go down to where the vault is, and they will remove the evidence from the vault and put it into my custody. And at that point, I take it and examine it.
Ms. Pagan, in addition to any markings that are put on items of evidence by evidence technicians or by any other member of a law enforcement agency, do you also put your initials on these items of evidence so you can identify them in court?
Yes, if they're large enough, I will put my initials and sometimes the case number and the exhibit number on them.
I want to start with items that were submitted to you, not necessarily in groups or in the order, but with regard to whether or not you could identify them. So in that regard, I'd like to start with fragments that you attempted to identify. Your Honor, may I have a minute to?
Yes, ma'am.
let me show you first States 188 in evidence. And Judge, may she step down to avoid me going back and forth?
Yes, ma'am.
Let me ask you to step towards the end of this table, and we'll use the table as something on which we can prop these items of evidence. And make sure, I want you to face our court reporter. Go to the end of the table, please. I'm sorry, no, the other end.
Yes, ma'am.
And then it's a little difficult, but the jurors all need to hear you, and I need to get you a microphone. Can she have a clip microphone, because she's going to be holding exhibits? Will this be in your way right there? Oh. I believe a clip microphone will work better for her. I'm going to try to go through these exhibits fairly quickly. I think what we need to do, quite frankly, give me one more minute. Could you help me, sir? Could you move this way for me, please? The whole thing, and then also the one on the bottom. All right, now, Ms. Pagan, once you get that situation, if you'd stand this way and face all of the jurors and let the court reporter be able to see your face when you're testifying, keep your voice up as loud. Would you test your microphone?
Yes, it's working.
All right. I'm going to start with States 188, ma'am, and ask you to hold this towards the jurors and describe what this item is and whether or not you were able to identify it to any particular gun.
All right, these two items are fragments. I did not receive these items to examine myself, but this item here appears to be a lead alloy fragment, and most likely, typically, the lead alloy fragment is probably the core of a jacketed bullet. The cores of if you have a core jacketed bullet, it's not going to have the information, those marks I was talking about. They won't have marks on them that I would need to make an identification, because the core did not come, when the bullet was traveling down the barrel, the core did not come in contact with the barrel. It was the jacket that comes in contact with the barrel. So the marks I need are on the jacket, not on a core. So this is probably from a fragmented bullet, and the core separated from the jacket some and was damaged.
All right, let me show you two other items that are entered into evidence then. This one is States 189, and ask you again, are these fragmented portions of bullets?
Yes, these appear to be fragmented portions from bullets.
Okay. And would you have been able to identify those to any particular gun?
I would have to have examined them myself and have looked at them under a microscope to be able to say for sure whether or not I could have identified them. However, the fact that they are very damaged and deformed lessens the odds that I would have been able to make an identification.
And are these types of fragments that you've just shown to the jury in States 188 and 189, are they consistent with having gone through a single or double layer of metal such as a car door?
There's no way for me to be able to tell that.
Okay. Are there times when an even more substantial projectile, one not quite so fragmented, cannot be identified as having been fired from a particular gun?
Yes, I mean, we can have bullets that are in very good condition, in almost pristine condition, that don't have a lot of damage, but you still might not be able to identify them, because some firearms don't mark their bullets very well. So there are just some guns that don't mark bullets well, and if they're not marked well, I have no information to work with, so I might not be able to make an identification.
Were there some items submitted in this case that you actually could look at to determine whether or not you could make an identification?
Referring to bullets?
All types of things. We'll start with one at a time, and I'll go through it with you. Ms. Wolfson, help me judge, and that'll avoid walking back and forth. Could you hand Ms. Pagan States 186 that's in evidence? We have things everywhere. Hold on. Here's 186. Thank you. Now, did you examine that particular item to determine whether or not you could identify or eliminate it from the gun in this case?
Yes, I did.
And how do you know that you examined that particular item?
I've written my case number exhibit on the outer packaging, and as well as abbreviated version on the jacket itself.
How did you try to determine whether or not this fragment had been fired from this gun that's in States 185?
What we do is I take the gun, I inspect it to see if it appears to be functional and operational condition. Once I determine it's safe to fire, we have a range. So I take it into the range, and as I mentioned before, I fire it into water. We have a large water tank that we can fire the guns into, and that enables the bullet to stay in pristine condition. So I took my fired bullets that I know came from the gun, because I fired them myself, and I will take the evidence, and I have what's called a comparison microscope. It allows me to mount the test bullet and then mount the evidence bullet, and I can look at them side by side together and move it around and rotate them. And I look for correspondence of those markings that we spoke about earlier, and I try to find enough correspondence to make an identification.
And on States 186, were you able to either identify or eliminate that projectile as having been fired from this firearm?
No, I was not.
Okay. And now if we could go to States 190 in evidence, and I think they may be down here. Well, I'm going to put these up together, I think. If you'll, I think just hold it for her, please. Starting with States 190, which is on the left-hand side, did you examine that projectile to see if you could determine whether or not it was fired from this Taurus 9mm?
Yes, I did.
And how do you know that that's one of the ones you examined?
Again, I've put my case exhibit and initials on the packaging as well as abbreviated on the bullet itself.
All right, let me ask you to look at States 192 before we go on to your findings.
Yes.
You also examined that one?
Yes, I did.
With regard to States 190, were you able to either identify or eliminate that projectile as having been fired from this 9mm Taurus?
No, I was not.
And tell the jurors why.
As with the one we mentioned previously and this one as well as the third bullet, they did not mark very well, and even my tests that I fired myself into the water tank, they were not well marked.
Right. And what about with regard to States 192?
Same thing, I was not able to identify it or eliminate it, and it was not well marked.
In your report, you designate certain ammunition, specifically the three things you've just shown to the jury as 9mm, 38, or 357 caliber class bullets.
Yes.
Explain to the jury why you would categorize it as possibly all three.
Caliber class is just referring to the diameter of a bullet. 9mm Luger cartridge cases have a diameter, the bullet has a diameter of .354. 38 special cartridge cases have a diameter of .354. 357 Magnum cartridges the bullets have a diameter of .354. They all have the same diameter, which puts them in the same caliber class. That caliber class is called 9mm caliber class, which is the metric designation, but it's commonly called 38 caliber class. And then to be clear, we also will sometimes call it 357 caliber class so that people know that bullet could have been fired in a 9mm Luger gun, a 38 special revolver, or a 357 Magnum revolver, because they all have the same diameter. The barrel is the same diameter.
All right. And with regard to States 186, 190, and 192, are they all consistent with the size for being 9mm ammunition?
Yes, they could have all been fired in a 9mm Luger pistol.
All right, thank you. Did you also compare spent shell casings as evidence to determine if those had been fired by the Taurus 9mm?
Yes, I did.
Okay. And how do you conduct such a test?
It's similar to the test that I do with the bullets. When I fire the gun into the water tank, the bullets go into the tank, but the cartridge cases are ejected. I collect those ejected cartridge cases that I know were fired in this gun, and I mount them on my comparison microscope, and then I mount the evidence cartridge cases on the other side, and I compare the markings. When the gun is fired, as I mentioned, the explosion happens and the bullet travels down the barrel. At the same time, the bullet's going down the barrel, the cartridge cases are being slammed against the inside surface of the gun, and it's that motion which causes it to automatically cycle the gun. And when it slams against those inside surfaces and rubs against the inside of the chamber, it can receive marks. It will take the impression of the surface of the gun, will often be impressed well enough for us to see them on a comparison microscope. And it's those marks we look at to each other to see if there's enough correspondence to make an identification or an elimination.
I'm going to show you 5 9mm casings that were recovered at the scene in this case by Detective Kipple and ask you, ma'am, are those 5 9mm casings consistent with having been fired from the pistol in States 186?
Yes, I was able to identify the cartridge cases to this pistol.
Now let me show you States 194 in evidence. I apologize for all the walking back and forth. Is it down here? Hold on 1 second. What are you saying? Oh, I'm sorry, 196. My apologies. Can you show those to the juror?
Yes.
And were you able to determine whether the 4 cartridge casings that Detective Smith recovered from the windshield of the black Jetta were ejected from this 9mm Taurus?
I was able to identify them as having been fired in this pistol.
Okay. And now 194 is inside this large display, marked overall as States 194, but with regard to the only fired cartridge case that's contained in 194, were you able to determine whether or not that cartridge case, which was found inside the Jetta by Philip Miranda, was fired from that 9mm Taurus?
Yes, I identified this cartridge case as well.
Thank you. If we can stay on this particular exhibit, 194, and I'd like you to pull the magazine out of the exhibit. I think it pulls straight up. Comes right out. All right. Can you tell the jurors how one loads bullets into that magazine or cartridges into that magazine?
The bullets load from the top of the magazine, and you just have to push them down. This is spring loaded, and you just push them down until it's full.
And how does the action work to then load a bullet from that magazine into the 9mm pistol?
Well, the magazine would be inserted into the grip of the pistol, and then to load it, you have to pull the slide backwards far enough, and then when it moves forward, it's going to feed the top bullet off of the magazine and into the chamber.
What is the capacity of that magazine? How many whole cartridges will it hold?
I'm going to need to,
Please, sir. And if you want to set your notes next to Ms. Wolfson to make it easier.
The capacity was 15.
Okay. And then my next question, that's on this particular magazine,
On this
is that
magazine,
correct?
yes.
Okay. What if the gun handler puts a round in the chamber? Does that affect the total number of bullets that can be loaded into this specific weapon?
Yes, it is possible for the person to load one cartridge in the chamber. I'm sorry. Yes, you can load one cartridge in the chamber and have the slide closed, and then you can put your magazine, which has 15, if it's loaded, would have 15 in it, and you can put your magazine in the bottom. So essentially, you'd have 16 cartridge cases able to be fired, the 15 in the magazine and the one that's in the chamber.
Right. And would you please, I tell you what, let's talk about the holster very briefly. If you could pull this out for me. Did you ever look at this holster?
I did not receive this in evidence, no.
But is that holster large enough to hold that 9mm handgun?
Yes.
Does anything about the holster affect the ability for that gun to fire or not fire?
No.
Could the gun fire if it remained in the holster?
If something was able to pull the trigger while it was in the holster, then it would be able to fire, as long as the trigger was pulled.
Let me ask you now, please, ma'am, to pull out the firearm. And Your Honor, I believe your bailiffs have checked it as well as the safety strap is still through it. Is that permissible with the
Yes,
court?
ma'am. Yes,
All right. Ms. Pagan, if you'll pull out that Taurus 9mm. Did you check this pistol for function?
Yes, I did.
Is there anything wrong with the function or operation of this gun?
The firearm does fire. The only thing that I found that didn't operate quite like it was supposed to was one of the safeties.
All right. Why don't you go ahead and describe safeties for the jurors?
The safeties are usually a mechanism designed to help prevent any kind of accidental shootings.
How many safeties are there in this gun?
This gun has 3 different safeties that we would consider as safeties. It has a thumb safety, which is a lever here on the side, that when you push it in one position, it can't be fired, the trigger won't pull. It also has internal safeties. It has what's called a firing pin block. It's not something the user can manually manipulate. It's a mechanism inside the gun that blocks the firing pin, which I mentioned has to drop to hit the primer. And the only way to disengage it is to pull when the trigger's pulled, it has a mechanism that disengages that firing pin block. So when the gun is just sitting as it is, the firing pin block is engaged, meaning the firing pin is blocked to help prevent any accidental shootings. And then the last one is called a hammer intercept notch. It's basically a safety notch for the hammer to rest on. So that's, right now it's cocked all the way back. The safety notch or hammer intercept notch is kind of midway between full cocked and fully closed.
Does the issue with the thumb safety on this firearm in any way impede the firing of this weapon?
No.
Okay. And tell the jurors what it means to fire this particular automatic in double action.
Double action is referring to a mode of trigger mechanism. If something fires in double action, that means when you pull the trigger, it is both cocking the hammer and releasing the hammer.
Is it fair to say that a double action of the gun means a single action of the shooter?
Yes, it's still just a pull, one single pull of the trigger.
What does it mean to fire this gun single action?
When a gun's fired single action, that would be like in the mode it's in now, it's already cocked. Someone manually cocked it. So when you pull the trigger, it does one thing, it drops the hammer. The trigger's not cocking the hammer this time. So double action, it both cocks and drops the hammer. Single action, the hammer's already cocked. So single action, you pull the trigger and the hammer just releases it, it drops it.
With regard to the external safety, or what I believe you call the thumb safety, is that the only external safety on this firearm?
Yes, that's the only one that we call a safety. Some people might call has a chamber loaded indicator, which means if there's a cartridge inside of it, it has this little lever on this side that will poke out a little bit, so you could feel it with your finger to know that it's loaded without actually opening the gun. Sometimes some people will call that a safety. Technically, we usually don't, but I thought I'd mention it.
Let me walk you through several things. I want you to assume that this gun has a loaded magazine in it without a round in the chamber. How many actions would a shooter have to take if that gun was inside of a compartment, closed, and then inside of this holster before he could get the gun in a ready-to-fire position?
I'm going to object, Your Honor, that calls for speculation.
I'm sorry, rephrase that.
I'm asking her how many basic actions, if the safety is on and there's not a round in the chamber, would it take for a shooter to pull the gun out of a closed compartment, out of that holster,
I got
and
it.
get
It's overruled.
and then get it in a ready-to-fire position?
Well, I think the actions would be, of course, you'd have to open the compartment, remove the gun and the holster, or remove the gun from the holster, and then you would have it in your hand and you'd be ready to fire.
Okay, but would you be ready to fire if the thumb safety was engaged, if it was on?
No, if the thumb safety was on, of course, you'd have to disengage the thumb safety.
And what would you have to do that?
It's a lever that has it on both sides. You can do it on the left or right side, and it just moves up and down. It won't move all the way up right now because it has this zip tie through it, but if the zip tie wasn't there, this lever would move up and the orange dot would be covered. And so in the position it is now where you can see the orange dot, that means it's ready to fire.
All right. And then if a round were already in the chamber, then but the safety was on, you'd still have to disengage the safety before actually pulling the trigger and firing, correct?
Yes, and to go back to your previous question, you also specified if there was no round in the chamber. The one additional action that the shooter would have to do besides taking it out of the compartment, taking it out of the holster, taking the safety off so that's ready to fire, you'd also have to cycle the slide. So you'd have to pull this slide backwards all the way and then let it go so that it feeds a bullet, a cartridge or bullet into the chamber.
For some reason, in common phrasage, do they call that racking it?
Yes, it's often called racking the slide.
Ms. Pagan, did you test fire this pistol?
Yes, I did.
And did you do that yourself?
Yes.
How did you do that?
Once I get the pistol and it determine it appears to be safe to fire, I go into the range and fire it into the tank.
And in which direction do the shell casings eject when this particular 9mm Taurus is fired?
I did not make note. We don't typically make note of which direction they eject because it's a highly variable process. But typically these type of guns will either eject up or to the right.
I'm sorry.
I said relevancy, I would object to, we're talking about typically what guns would do.
Overruled.
If a gun is being fired, this particular gun is being fired outside of a vehicle, could those shell casings actually hit the hood of the car and bounce off and land on the ground?
Of course, yes.
Could they hit the hood of the car and remain there if they get cradled somewhere?
Of course, yes.
Okay. And could they get obviously kicked once they're on the ground or moved once they're on the ground?
Yes.
Okay. Can you explain the trigger pull, what trigger pull generally is, and then we'll go specifically to this firearm?
Yes, trigger pull refers to the examination we do for trigger pull. We're trying to determine the approximate amount of force that's required to pull the trigger backwards and fire the gun.
All right. Why does trigger pull matter for purposes of your testing a firearm?
Well, we do an examination for the trigger pull because frequently we're requested to determine the trigger pull.
All right. And are some trigger pulls heavier on some guns than they are on others?
Yes, they can vary. Some are light and some are heavy.
All right. Can you give the jury a common example of what trigger pull means as far as the weight of the gun?
Something to
with the
compare it
trigger?
to, you mean?
Certainly.
Trigger pulls, most commonly, a common force of trigger pull would be about 5 pounds. So if you had an object that was about 5 pounds, like a 5-pound bag of sugar or something, and you can imagine how much that takes to lift that up, that might be a way to imagine about how much force is required to pull the trigger.
All right. And did you test this particular firearm for trigger pull?
Yes, I did.
What is the trigger pull of this Taurus 9mm when fired in single action?
When fired in single action, it's approximately 6 1/4 pounds.
What is the trigger pull of this Taurus 9mm when fired in double action?
Approximately 13 pounds.
Once a round is chambered, does the shooter still have to pull the trigger with a minimum of 6.25 pounds of trigger pull for each round that the shooter fires?
Yes, approximately.
Okay. May I have just one moment, Your Honor?
Yes, ma'am.
That's all I have, Ms. McDonough, if you don't mind putting that back on the stand. Thank you so much.
Ms. Hanania.
Yes, Your Honor.
Your Honor, may I request that the exhibits be removed just so that they're not being used
Sure.
as witness?
You're not going to need them.
I don't think so, sir. Thank you.
No, you're fine. It's all right, you're fine.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Good afternoon, ma'am. Ma'am, I believe that you testified that you work for the Florida Department of Law Enforcement,
Yes.
and that is a law enforcement agency that covers the entire state of Florida.
Yes.
And what you do is work on submitted items that are submitted to you from other law enforcement personnel in the state attorney's office.
Yes.
those submissions, you don't know where they come from, isn't that correct? Other than what you're told by somebody, is that right?
That's correct.
So when Ms. Corey was walking you through all these different items of evidence, and she was saying, this particular casing that was collected from this particular place by this particular person, none of that is any information that you actually know, correct?
That's correct.
And that was true for each of the items that she handed to you and asked you a question about, in which she gave you all that other information, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Now, ma'am, you were also asked about ejection patterns, correct?
Correct.
Now, Ms. Corey asked you about the casings in this particular, for that particular gun, the one that you had been just dealing with, right? About how those casings would have ejected from that gun, right?
Correct.
Okay. Your answer was that you didn't know in what manner the casings ejected. Isn't that right?
Correct.
But then you went on to give an answer as to what guns like that might do.
That's right.
Okay. But the answer in this case is you don't know how or in what pattern the casings were ejected. Is
That's
that
correct.
Okay.
Yes, I did not note which direction they ejected in.
Okay. And it's true that even if guns typically, of a particular class, typically eject right or typically eject left, there are always differences between guns. Isn't that right?
Yes, there can always be differences between guns. Correct.
Okay. And and it's also true, isn't it, ma'am, that even if there is some type of pattern to how casings eject, that's not a precise pattern, isn't that right?
That's right.
It's not like you can say that casings are always going to eject in an exact angle or an exact velocity. Isn't that right?
That's right.
It might, and isn't it true that even if it ejects right, it might eject up and right and over, it might eject in a flatter arc, and that would also affect the pattern of where the casings are. Isn't that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Now, ma'am, you were asked about the velocity of a fire projectile, and again, you said you didn't know in this particular gun what that velocity would be.
I believe she asked me about the distance it might be fired?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, and the distance would be affected by the velocity, correct?
Yes.
And by velocity, we mean the speed that a projectile is ejected from the barrel of the gun, right?
Yes, that's correct.
And ma'am, you deal with guns and bullets and casings all day long, correct?
Yes.
But you don't, your area of expertise is in terms of evaluating them, in terms of how they fire and things of that nature. You don't have anything to do with evaluating wounds and wound paths or anything like that, right?
That's correct.
That's a completely different area of expertise.
Yes.
Now, when you talked about the range on guns, wouldn't how the gun is pointed affect that as well?
Yes, of course.
Now, ma'am, in addition to the other things you were asked about, I believe, it was at least two different exhibits, State Exhibit number 188 and State Exhibit number 189, that your response to both of those exhibits was that you never examined those. Isn't that right?
That's correct. They were not submitted to our laboratory.
Okay. So in spite of the fact that you were handed these items in court and asked to talk about them, you never actually saw them before you came to court to testify about them. Isn't that right?
That's correct.
And so any any statements you made about those items are being made while you're looking at them through this display case that the state has put them in for purposes of trial. Is that
Yes,
right?
yes, that's correct.
And that would not be the way that you would conduct a scientific or forensic examination on any piece of actual evidence. Is that right?
Correct.
And that would be true for both Exhibits 188 and 189.
I don't recall the exhibit numbers myself, but I assume
Okay.
that is probably right.
It was for both of those items where you said, I didn't actually examine this.
Yes.
Okay. And you know the items that you did examine because you made markings on those exhibits or on the packaging in those exhibits to indicate that you had actually examined them. Isn't that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Now, I believe in those exhibits that you were asked to, well, I'm sorry, let me back up. In addition to those exhibits that you were asked to discuss that you'd never seen, you were then asked about several exhibits that you had seen, but you could not identify as having been fired from the gun that's involved in this case, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And I believe that was at least 3 of them. Am I correct, ma'am?
Yes, there were 2 bullets and 1 bullet jacket.
Okay. And for all 3 of those items, the 2 bullets and the 1 bullet jacket, you indicated that you can't link those items to that particular gun. Isn't that right?
I cannot either identify or eliminate them from having been fired from that gun, yes.
So the bottom line is you can't say that they were fired from that gun.
Correct.
And when you were asked if all of them could have been fired from a 9mm Luger, and you indicated that they could have been, isn't it also true, ma'am, that based on your testimony here today, they could have also been fired from a .357?
Yes, that's correct.
They could have also been fired from a .38?
Yes, that's correct.
And now, ma'am, you were next asked to talk about several items in which you had identified the casings to the particular gun at issue in this case. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Now, and while you could in fact say that those particular items had in fact been fired from the gun at issue in this case, there is nothing in your examination of those items that can tell this jury anything about the circumstances in which those items were fired. Isn't that right?
Yes.
Excuse me. Now, ma'am, you were asked about the capacity of the magazine, and you indicated it was 15 rounds, and then as to whether or not there could also be a round in the chamber of that gun. Is that right?
Yes.
Isn't it true, ma'am, that there's no way to know from even your scientific forensic examination whether or not there was in fact a chamber in the gun in relation to this incident or any other incident?
That's correct. I assume you mean that there was, whether or not there was a cartridge in the chamber?
Yes,
Correct.
ma'am.
Right,
I'm
right, there's
sorry,
no way
I
for me to
spoke.
tell.
I'm sorry, say that again. I spoke over you. I apologize.
No, that's okay, that's correct. There's no way for me to tell if there was a cartridge in the chamber as well as a completely loaded magazine.
All right. Now, you were asked about safeties, and you're talking about 3 safeties now. Just to be very clear, this internal safety and the hammer intercept, and these are my terms, but for lack of a better term, those are static instruments of safety, right? And there's nothing that the user of the gun can do to change those particular mechanisms. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. The firing pin block is internal, so there's nothing that the user can change on that. The hammer intercept notch is, the user can put the hammer on that notch, But there's nothing that the user would really could really change about unless they were altering
Okay.
something on the gun.
So the only really user-affected safety mechanism is the thumb safety, is that right, ma'am?
Yes.
Okay. Now, isn't it true that it doesn't take very much effort at all to either to engage or disengage that thumb safety, is that right?
Typically speaking, it's not too hard to engage or disengage, yes.
And for somebody who is familiar with firearms, that is disengaging the thumb safety, if it were on, wouldn't take any thought at all. Isn't that correct?
Well, I mean, you have to think about disengaging it, but it does not take much physical effort.
Okay. That it would, if someone, again, is familiar with guns, it would be like second nature to, if you pick up the gun, flip off the safety and do whatever you're going to do. Is that right?
I would assume that if someone has had a lot of practice with the gun, that it would become a habit.
Yes. And so it's not a complicated process at all?
No, I would not call it complicated, in my opinion.
And if someone not only is familiar with firearms, but familiar with that particular gun, it would take even less thought or effort in order to disengage that safety. Isn't that right?
Again, I would assume that if someone's practiced with the firearm a lot, that it becomes a habit to do it without much effort.
Okay. Now, and the other thing, ma'am, and that there's nothing about your forensic examination that tells us, or this jury, whether or not the safety was or was not engaged on this particular day.
Correct.
Now, you talked about single action and double action in reference to this gun. Am I correct in that if there is no round in the chamber, that you would have to manually rack the slide, which is what you're calling double action, is that right? And then fire?
No, if you've manually racked the slide, racking the slide doesn't have anything to do with whether it's called double action or single action.
Mm-hmm.
Although if you've racked the slide, then that will put it in single action mode at that point.
Okay.
Sorry, that's probably what you were
Yeah.
trying to get to. Yes, if you've manually racked the slide, that causes the hammer to be cocked. So then the slide closes, the hammer is still cocked. So at that point, if you pull the trigger, it's going to be single action mode.
Okay. And once that's happened, and if a person continued to fire, would every action after that be single action?
Yes, because each time it's fired, the slide will automatically be racked, move backwards, cock the gun, feed a new cartridge and close. And so each time it's fired, this is happening, so it's in single action mode the whole time.
Now, ma'am, you were asked also about the trigger pull.
Correct.
And testing the trigger pull. You fired this particular gun, is that right?
Yes, I did.
And you fired it several times, is that right?
Yes, I fired it twice.
Okay. And there wasn't anything particularly hard about pulling that trigger, isn't that right?
I wouldn't call it very hard.
Did you have to concentrate really hard to pull that trigger?
Well, whenever I fire a gun, I always try to focus on what I am doing.
Certainly, as an expert. However, just the action itself,
To the form of that question.
Sustain.
just the action itself, ma'am, did you have to give any great thought or effort in terms of pulling that trigger?
Just the action of, no, I would say you tell yourself to pull your finger back and it pulls back.
And, ma'am, when you examined the gun, there wasn't anything about it that looked altered or enhanced in any way, is that right?
Nothing that I noticed appeared to be altered.
If I may have 1 moment, Your Honor?
Yes, ma'am.
I don't have anything further.
Ms. Corr?
Ms. Pagan, if that 9mm Taurus was fired 10 times, single action, it still would have taken 6.25 pounds of trigger pull every time the trigger was pulled. Is that correct?
Yes, approximately 6.25 pounds.
Thank you. No further questions, Your
May she
Honor.
be excused?
She may.
Ms. Hannity? Thank you, ma'am. You're excused. Ladies and gentlemen, that will do it for the day. And so that concludes 6 long, hard days of work. I can't thank you enough for your time and attention. And tell you that, y'all mind? I can't thank you enough for your time and attention over this past week, and obviously we have a day off tomorrow, which is, I'm sure, well needed, so everybody can rest up a little bit and rejuvenate for Monday. Do not discuss the case among yourselves. Don't let anybody discuss the case with you. Be careful over the weekend or tomorrow. I know the bailiffs will be there as far as television and things of that are concerned. I think they might be arranging some visits and things of that nature. Be careful about that as well. Don't let anybody discuss the case with you. I think we've taken precautions as to that, but we just want to make sure we maintain our group as we have throughout the last week. So again, I can't thank you all enough for your patience and your time and your attention. Have a great evening, and we'll see you Monday morning. We will resume Monday morning at 9 o'clock. Can I see Mr. Guy, Ms. Hannity? I need some phone numbers for over the weekend.